Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to presentation. Sorry I couldn't make it to the conference in January due to the weather, but I'm glad you are on and ready to learn a little bit about the energy incentives. So I'm Doug Kolker. I'm a partner out of Whipley. We're a top 20 national CPA advisory firm. I lead our energy incentive team, focusing strictly on the credits and incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to go through the 4 or 5 incentives today that are most applicable to organizations like yours. Please feel free to chime in with any questions through the chat. We will try to monitor those and answer them as we go through. I do have some time at the end for some Q&A if needed as well. So with that, we'll get going. So here's a list of all of the energy incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act. This Inflation Reduction Act went into effect January 1 of 2023. So everything we're talking about is potentially for energy systems, projects placed in service starting in 23 and going forward. The ones you see highlighted in yellow, those are the ones I'm going to be talking about today. They're the ones that are most applicable. The rest of these are geared towards manufacturing, geared towards carbon sequestration, biofuel, hydrogen, other unique energy systems. Not to say that you wouldn't be eligible for them, but we have not had many conversations really with schools regarding this. One question before getting into the details of these credits that we get often asked is, what is the status of these credits with, everything going on up in DC? So the investment tax credits, everything we're talking about today is tax law. And so in order for these to be changed, they have to go to a vote of Congress, and they, would have to more than likely phase something in. All the executive orders that, you heard about or have read about is tied to funding, grants, funding sources for these projects. Those definitely could go away. Those are at risk for executive orders. They don't have to necessarily go to a vote of Congress. The other interesting thing about it having to go to a vote is, per the slide here, you can see that the states that have benefited the most from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a Democrat program, are red states. So we find it hard to believe that the Congress people for those states would vote against changing the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. They are starting to hit, EV charging stations seem to be coming up a lot. So we do see that being possibly affected. But as far as like solar, geothermal, wind projects, we don't see any changes coming for the tax credit itself here in the short term, or really even in the next couple of years. They would have to phase this out over time if they make changes. Too many projects are in motion right now with these tax credits as part of their capital stack. So the first credit that I'm going to talk about is the investment tax credit or the clean electricity investment tax credit. So think solar, geothermal, wind. These are the energy systems that this tax credit is applicable to. I will go over here in a little bit how the credit works, how it's calculated, and then I'll also talk about how, the schools monetize these credits, since that's the most unique thing with the Inflation Reduction Act on, how schools, tax-exempt organizations, government organizations can, monetize these tax credits. So the difference here is the investment tax credit, Section 48, is for systems placed in service in 23 and 24. Starting here in 25, it switches over to what they call 48E, which is that clean electricity investment tax credit. They're calculated the same. The biggest difference is for the 48E credit, they added a layer of tax exempt or gas house greenhouse gas emissions, having zero greenhouse gas emissions. So there is this added layer that does have to meet certain qualifications. Solar, it probably doesn't affect it much. It's geothermal systems where that could come into play. However, there are some unique things with geothermal systems that you may be able to pick and choose which one of these credits you're eligible for. Here's how the credit works. I'll get into details on each of these layers on future slides, but just as a quick overview, the credit itself starts at 6%. It jumps to that 30%, or what they call a 5 times multiplier. There's two ways to get to that 30%. The first is if the system is under a megawatt, then you're automatically at 30%. If the system is over a megawatt, then you have to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. And again, that is basically meaning that the contractors working on the energy system, not the entire school building if you were doing a whole new build, just the energy system, have to meet Davis-Bacon wages or union wages. So if you meet that, but you have to meet it throughout the entire construction process, not just at the end. So that gets you to 30%. Then there's these 3 additional adders, each one at 10%, and I'll go into each one of those here in a minute. But domestic content is US made, energy community is if you're in an energy zone, and then the low income adder is if you're deemed to be in a low income community. So as I mentioned, again, 30% automatically if you're under a megawatt. Otherwise, you have to meet that prevailing wage. And, you know, for a solar system, a megawatt is pretty easy to calculate. For a geothermal system, you've got to be under 3.4 million BTUs for heating and 284 tons for cooling. And again, if you meet those requirements, you're at 30%. If you do go over that megawatt and need the prevailing wage requirement, it is highly recommended that you have a firm like us or somebody, a third party, validate those certified payroll records for you, either on a payroll basis or at least on a monthly basis. Reason being, if you find that there was an error and somebody wasn't paid the exact correct wage, you have a 30-day window to correct this without any penalties. So by having somebody, a third party, validate this for you, you then have to make, if you come up $1 short per hour, you have to make a payment to that specific individual. And doing it, you know, within 2 to 4 weeks, that individual is still there, versus if you wait to the end of the system or the end of the project, they may no longer be there. And again, you have a 30-day window to correct with no penalties. Nick, I don't know, I saw somebody post a question. I wasn't sure what it said.
Gave the link to the handout again. I don't see a
Gotcha.
question here.
So, like I said, you know, the prevailing wage could really be, you really need to be aware of this from the very beginning of your conversations with your contractors, from, you know, the design side of it as well. Because if you don't meet this and you determine at the end of the system that you don't end up meeting the prevailing wage, that 30% goes back to that 6%, and all of those 10% adders that I showed, those all drop back to 2%. So it can become quite expensive by not meeting the prevailing wage requirement. And there is a website you can go to called sam.gov. Put in your county or your city. It will put out a report by trade of what the prevailing wage is. It's not the most user-friendly website, but they do have it, you know, both wage and benefits, and you just have to be combined of those two as far as meeting it by that trade. And again, this is only on the trades touching the energy system. So for example, if you've got a new build and you've got concrete being poured for the walls, those people do not need to meet the prevailing wage requirement to be eligible for the tax credit. Only those touching solar or geothermal systems. So the first adder I'm going to talk about, again, is the energy community. Basically, there's a mapping system the IRS has that we can look at. And if you're in the energy community zone, you get the extra 10%. And those are former brownfield sites, coal closure sites. So they have a whole mapping system to look at. Again, if you're in one of these zones under the megawatt, it's 10%. If you're over the megawatt and don't meet the prevailing wage requirement, you drop down to 2%. The second adder is domestic content. So this is a adder for where you can see here starting in 24. So now in 25, it's up to 45%. 45% of the system, energy system, has to be US manufactured. We're finding this a little bit hard to hit in solar systems due to the fact that most of the major components are made overseas still. Now, some of those other tax incentives that I showed on that first slide, there are some incentives for manufacturers in the US to produce more solar components here in the US over the coming years. So I think this will be a little bit easier to hit in the next year or two. For geothermal systems, it's definitely a little bit easier to hit. More and more of those components are already made in the US. The challenge you have with this is you do have to sort of swim upstream and get the costs and verification from the vendors, the suppliers. So, you know, it does take a little bit of work to get the vendors and the suppliers to provide the right documentation. You know, from an IRS standpoint, the two biggest areas that we see that they would audit these if they come under audit is this domestic content and if you have to meet the prevailing wage requirement. The rest of these adders are sort of a little bit more cut black and white. These have a little bit more interpretation to them, which is going to lead to more audit analysis. The third adder is if you're deemed to be in a low-income community. And so the way this works is, again, they have the DOE and the IRS have a mapping system. And if you're in the low-income zone, it shows up you're in the zone, then great, you're eligible. However, this is an application process. So it's not guaranteed you're going to get it. That middle section there is the allocation, how they basically allocated 800 megawatts throughout 4 different categories. And as each of these categories get used up, then you're out of luck. So if you go in, you know, put a system in service later this year and apply for this because you're in a low income zone, the chances are the allocation is going to be gone. For 2024, the only allocation that didn't get used up was the ones located on Indian land. The portal system for this is open. So if you are planning on putting an energy system in service here in 25 and are in a low income zone, I highly recommend you get the application in immediately. The other thing with this is you have to receive your allocation letter prior to turning the system on. So that's a key factor on timing. So right now they had a 30-day window when the application opened here from January 16th to February 14th. That window basically just meant anybody that applied in those 30 days deemed to have applied at the same time. After that, it's a rolling application basis. And as you can see in the last paragraph, this portal system, application system is open till August 1st. So again, if you are putting a system in place, highly recommend you explore this as soon as possible before the allocations run out. So I've talked about how the credit is calculated. Basically, at the end of the day, as I said, you can be anywhere from 6, more likely 30%, all the way up to 50, 60%. Now, there's a couple of things that can reduce the credit. The biggest one being how you pay for the system. If you're using general funds, a loan, anything not restricted or tax exempt, you don't have anything to worry about. You get 100% of the credit. If you're using tax exempt financing or restricted grants, you need to go through a calculation and potentially have to reduce the credit amount by up to a maximum of 15%. You go through that calculation. If it's the less than 15%, then it just gets reduced by whatever that percentage is. So again, ideally, if you've got a mixture of tax exempt financing, general funds, what you really want to do is use your general funds to pay for all of the energy systems, use the tax exempt financing or restricted funds for everything else. You do want to make sure you document that appropriately for IRS audit purposes. But this way, if you're showing that you use general funds to pay for the energy system, you can show that, you don't have to take this 15% reduction. And here's an example of how the credit would work. You spend $1 million on an energy system, a solar system, or a geothermal system. Generally, that's going to be under a megawatt. To be over a megawatt, usually your solar systems have to be at 1.2 to 1.5 million, and a geothermal system has to be a couple of $1 million or more to get up over that megawatt. So in this scenario, you're under a megawatt, automatically qualifying for that 30%. We're showing here that you've met all the adders. So here you would get a $600,000 credit. We're stating here that it was paid for 100% by tax exempt financing or bonds. So we would reduce that by 90 grand. So the net credit would be $510,000 that you will get a check back or money wired directly back into your account through the direct pay program, which I'll go over here in a little bit. And everything we're showing here, these are all federal credits, all federal dollars. There are state incentives out there, local incentives and grants. There's utility rebates out there. So you can get a lot of this system paid for through all the incentives that are out there. The biggest challenge is you do have to pay for the system up front and then have to wait more so on the back end to receive a lot of these incentives. The best scenario or the best recommendation we have to determine the state and local incentives for you is to kind of start with your utility company. We don't really have a great resource to dive into it from our end, just because every state and locality and utility company is different. So if you start with the utility company, they usually can help you and guide you to more the incentives on the state and local side. So next, I'm going to talk about how this turns into cash for organizations like yours that don't pay taxes. So they created this direct pay or elective pay option for applicable entities, which are tax exempt organizations, government entities, tribal land, anybody not paying federal taxes. And the way it works is you have to go through an IRS portal system to pre-register. So, and you do this around the time that the system is placed in service. So these credits you apply for them in the year it's placed in service. So you may start the project, in 24, but if it's placed in service here in 25, then that's when you would file for 25. If it goes into 26, then you would file for 26 taxes and get the direct pay option. And the way the portal works is you put in information about your organization, you put in information about the system. They do require you to upload certain documents about the system, permits showing the construction's complete and you own the system, information showing that it's generating power or hooked up to the utility system, the energy system. Then once you apply, it may take 60, 90 days. The IRS will eventually issue a registration number. And that registration number then goes on the tax forms that you need to file. And you do have to file tax forms. Even if you don't file tax forms at all, you do have to file a Form 990T. And so that 990T gets filed with that pre-registration number. It includes the calculation of the credit. And then, once it's submitted and once the IRS has accepted the tax return, and the IRS does recommend to file these electronically. So you do usually need a CPA firm that has the tax software to file these electronically. Problem with filing paper is, one, chances of it getting lost, and two, it will take longer to get your money. On the IRS website, they state that, if you file electronically, it should take 90 days roughly to get the money to you. So that's why they are recommending filing electronically. You also do have to file for this credit on an originally filed return. So basically meaning, if you put a system in place here in 25, you have till basically November of 26 to file for these. That's when a 990T is due. It's originally due 5/15. There's a 6-month extension to get you to 11/15. So if you put anything in place in 24, definitely want to explore and make sure you're taking advantage of these incentives. Anything that was placed in 23, if you didn't take advantage of these incentives, you are out of luck. You cannot go back and amend for these credits. So it's vitally important to be aware of the timing of filing these tax forms. A couple of other items to consider for tax-exempt organizations. I know a lot of schools are June year ends. There is an election that you can make to speed up the timing of getting these credits. If the only reason you're filing for these credits is or filing a 990T is to take advantage of these credits, you can elect a calendar year end. So what this means is, let's say you're June year end, June 30th year end. Ideally, you would want to try to get the system in place by that time frame, just much cleaner. However, let's say it gets placed in service in the second half of 25. Rather than having to wait till June 30th of 26 to even begin to file for these credits, you can make an election that you're on a calendar year end for these tax credits so that you can file in January and February. So basically, it speeds up the time frame of when you can receive your money. Most schools do not file a 990. However, if for some reason an organization does, the 990T would then have to be filed in conjunction with the 990. So again, if this is a fiscal year end and somebody is filing a 990 and the system gets placed in service after that fiscal year end, you will have to wait another 12 months before you can even file. And then you have 6 months to get the credit. So it could affect your cash flow by up to 18 to 24 months if you miss, don't pay attention to this fiscal year end, calendar year end timing. Again, the low income adder that I mentioned earlier, that's that application process. So again, you want to be applying for that as soon as you possibly can. You do need to have a contract in place with your solar provider or contractor doing the geothermal work. And then lastly, again, financing the system. Those are just things that I talked about, that tax exempt financing and being aware of, how best to pay for this system to maximize the tax credit. So that is everything related to the investment tax credit. Again, that's solar, geothermal, wind type projects. I'm now going to switch over to a different incentive. This is a deduction, so it's not a tax credit. And I know that schools don't need these deductions because they're, you don't pay taxes. I will walk through how you monetize this because it's a little bit unique. It's not nearly as lucrative as a investment tax credit, but just want to make you aware of this program that is out there. So 179D has been around for years. But up until the Inflation Reduction Act, it was only eligible for profit entities and government entities. The Inflation Reduction Act opened it up to tax exempt organizations. And what it is, this is for upgrades or new builds of your HVAC system, your lighting, or your wrap of the building. So if you've got an existing building and you upgrade your HVAC and are putting in more energy efficient units, or upgrading your lighting to like LED lighting, or putting in energy efficient windows, you can get up to potentially a $6 per square foot deduction. And again, I'll walk through how you guys can all monetize this. The deduction, though, to get the maximum deduction, you do have to meet that prevailing wage requirement. And I've got a slide here that'll kind of show you the difference between meeting the prevailing wage requirement and not meeting the prevailing wage requirement. As I said, the credit has been around for a while. Pre-Inflation Reduction Act, it was $1.88 maximum per square foot. With the Inflation Reduction Act, starting in 23, it was $5 a square foot. There's inflation riders, so anything placed in service here in 25 is going to be closer to $6 per square foot. So here's the slide I was talking about that shows how this works. Meeting the energy efficiency component of this is pretty easy. We use a 2007 ASHRAE regs as your baseline. So pretty much anything you put in service today is going to meet that energy efficiency. It really is that prevailing wage requirement to get you to that maximum $5, $6 per square foot. If you don't meet it, you can see you're down in that 50 cents to $1 a square foot. So this really does not become economical for organizations, tax exempt organizations, if you're down in that small square footage. So the way that this works is, since your organizations don't need the deductions, don't pay taxes, you are able to allocate this deduction to a designer, architect, anybody involved in the design aspect, the contractor, the HVC company, anybody that is involved in the design aspect. And so if you take them, so if you take a 50,000 square foot building and you meet the maximum deduction, that's a $300,000 deduction. So if you allocate that to the designer, that's equivalent to about $100,000 tax savings. And so what we would recommend to our tax exempt organizations now is, don't give that away for free anymore, since this is, up to $6 a square foot, not $1.88 a square foot. And see if you can get back from your designer 20, 30 cents is on the dollar is kind of what we see, but whether it's a donation or contribution back to the organization, a football team, or put a credit on the account for repairs and maintenance or a future project. We don't get involved in the brokering of these or the negotiations. We will arm you with, do an estimate at no cost to tell you, okay, here's what we think your deduction is. Here's the net present value to the tax savings to your designer. And then that way you're armed with the numbers. You go and try to negotiate with one of them. We've seen some of our clients get 50, 60 cents on the dollar if you're working with an organization that is more philanthropic. And you guys control all of the power. You have to sign an allocation letter. Without signing that allocation letter, nobody can take this deduction. Now, to be fair, we have seen a few architects, construction companies starting to slip into their paperwork this allocation letter. And so some organizations, some of our clients have signed this letter without really knowing what it is. And now they're sort of out of luck. We don't believe that's fair from a contractor standpoint, but we are seeing that now that, again, this is a first come, first serve. So if they get the letter first, then they get to take that deduction. And here's just a couple of examples of how this can work. First one there, a high school lighting upgrade, an 86,000 square foot building. They met the energy efficiency, so they were able to allocate a $303,000 deduction to the designer. Again, that's $100,000 tax savings. That's the cash savings to the designer that they allocated it to. The second one there is talking about a geothermal project, and you can do both of these programs, the investment tax credit and the 179D. So as you can see there in the last bullet point, they were able to allocate $382,000 to the designer, and in this case, take a $900,000 or receive $900,000 direct payment for the investment tax credit. So as I said, this is not nearly as lucrative as the investment tax credits. It is out there. It is worth bringing this up as early on as you can in your design phases. Because again, the other option you can potentially do is if you want to allocate this to your architect, your designer, maybe you can get them to reduce the cost up front for the benefit that they're getting here, or for a percentage of this benefit, versus having to wait till it's all said and done and waiting for that contribution back. So now moving on to charging stations. This is a tax credit, not a deduction. So this is back towards the similar to the solar and the wind. This is part of that direct pay program. So you would get the money directly from the government on this. The way this program works is you need to be in a low-income community. So that's the first hurdle. If you're deemed to be in a low-income community, and they have a separate mapping system and qualification system for the charging station. So if you are in the qualifying zones on the charging station, you automatically get a 6% credit. It jumps to 30% by meeting the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. There's no megawatt threshold. There's no threshold that makes it automatic. So again, if you're looking at putting in charging stations, you do want to have the conversation up front with your contractors on, are you meeting the prevailing wage requirements or not? We have seen that a lot of, most of these projects are, $100,000 to $200,000. It sometimes is not worth the additional cost to meet the prevailing wage. And a lot of clients will just take the 6% and be done with it. It does look like I have a typo in here, 5%. That should be 6%. And again, this is part of the direct pay program. You got to go through the same process as the solar system, where you got to pre-register, you've got to get the registration number, and you do have to file the same tax forms. Now, if you have multiple systems going in service, so let's say you put a solar system in and a charging station system in the same year, you would you can upload in the portal system two different systems, two different energy systems. They will eventually issue two different registration numbers, and then you file all the tax forms at the same time for both systems. And this is just our team. We have architects, engineers, CPAs, and attorneys. So we come at these projects from an architect engineering approach. That way, the architect engineering team, they kind of take the systems, analyze all the costs to help maximize the qualifying components and costs. And then they hand it off to myself and the accounting side, and then we're the ones that will help calculate the credit, support all of the adders if needed, create the report for audit defense purposes, and then help assist with the pre-registration portal and the filing system. So with that, those are the 3 or 4 main categories or incentives eligible to schools. I don't know if anybody has questions. I believe we're going to get the slide deck out, which hopefully should have my contact information. If anybody wants to talk specifics, we have no problem. We get on calls all day long, help educate you, walk you through kind of, does your system qualify, not qualify, to make sure you're heading down the correct path.